let's bring in Scott Lauber, Philly.com, the Inquirer, the Daily News, as he joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. And Scott, a lot of people don't know if they should dive in with 2 feet. But after that 42-game stretch, have you seen enough to make you a believer in this team?
Well, I've certainly seen enough to feel like we're going to have a meaningful summer of baseball, and that's not something that we've had a whole lot here in the past 6 or 7 years. So, it's interesting. I sort of heard what you were talking about when you put me up here before I came on, and talking about how, well, it doesn't really matter what you think or I think in terms of whether or not they're a serious contender. They think they are, and 10 days ago, when this stretch against the Nats and Yankees began, you'll remember it was a Friday night in D.C. and they won big. And I asked Gabe Kapler after that game, I said, do you feel like you've made, a game like this makes a statement? You've got this stretch of 10 straight games against the Nats and Yankees, and you just beat the Nats pretty badly at home on a Friday night. And he said, well, maybe, but he goes, I think we're past that. He goes, I think we're past the point of, trying to prove to people that we're for real. We're for real. And I thought it was pretty telling that he said that at that time, and that 10 days later they win a game like they won yesterday, and nobody in that clubhouse was as surprised as any of us that they were able to pull a game out like that. So there's definitely belief in the room, and that's probably what matters most.
Yeah, 6-4 in their last 10 games in that Nationals and Yankees series, and I think a lot of people kind of figured, all right, you're going to see a tough stretch here. And if maybe they're still hanging around, after that stretch of games, we'll see. But the fact that they were able to go 6-4 in that 10-game stretch, I guess is a pretty good indication that they're right, that they're probably in this for the long haul now. So what do they need now? We're into July. If you're saying, all right, they're going to play meaningful baseball, what's lacking from this team?
I think what they do now in the next 30 days is really the biggest question, and maybe the only question facing this team right now. And it's a question that only the front office can answer. I think you watch them play, and everyone can see that they're probably one big hitter short of having a pretty scary offense. So whether that's Mike Moustakas, or whether it's Adrian Beltre, or whether it's the really big fish in Manny Machado, Matt Klentak's going to have to decide how aggressive he wants to be in adding that piece. It's going to cost you less probably if it's a Moustakas than if it's a Machado. Machado is going to make a bigger impact. So, you just have to sort of decide what's how aggressively do you go for it here. I think that they're probably still a bullpen piece short, as well as the bullpen pitched over the weekend, and it's hard to sit here and say, well, they're bullpen deficient after they have, 2 games the way they had on Saturday and Sunday. I do think that they need another bullpen piece. And, people are going to look at Hamels and Happ especially being out there and say, well, what would it look like if you added another starting pitcher like that? And as good as the rotation's been for most of the year, I think it's worth looking at that and saying, well, what can another starting pitcher do for them? So, I think if I had to rank them, and that's how I do it: hitter, bullpen piece, starter. But I think all three have to be on the table, given where they stand and what the opportunity is in front of them.
Scott Lauber with us. Scott, you mentioned the bullpen. Yeah, .60 ERA, 1 earned run, 15 innings pitched, 13 strikeouts the last 2 games. Plus, they got used a lot, at least 7 innings in 3 consecutive games for the first time since 1928, for gosh sakes. That's not the way you want to draw it up. But since you mentioned Pat Neshek, what does he add to the bullpen, and how important is that piece to have Pat Neshek back? How do you think Kapler's going to use Pat Neshek now that he's back with a big league club?
Well, they think it's a huge addition. Both Kapler and Klentak have said within the past, I think, 2 or 3 weeks that Neshek is probably as good a bullpen piece as any team is going to add before July 31st. And if he pitches the way he pitched last year, that's certainly true. One thing we know about him is he's a little finicky in terms of how he's used and how much he wants to pitch in different situations and whatnot. And I don't know how that's going to play in the role-less Gabe Kapler bullpen, but, I do think Neshek is unique in the way he pitches, the delivery, the effect he has on hitters, because they just don't see guys who come from that angle. So maybe he is the piece that they need to really kind of deepen the bullpen and round it out. I think, the bullpen is one area where they can afford to sit tight probably until really close to the 31st and sort of see how that bullpen market shakes out, see how Neshek pitches, see how the health of the rest of the bullpen is. I mean, they're going to get Ramos back. They're going to get Garcia back at some point. So, I think they'll have a clearer picture in, let's say, 3 weeks, a few days out from the deadline, just how aggressive they have to be in that area.
A clearer picture, and you talk about the role-less bullpen, but one role that Hector Neris thought he was in was the closer role, and now he's got his ticket back down to AAA, maybe this time for a longer period of time. I mean, they brought him back up pretty quick, but that was more out of necessity than out of the fact that they thought he was fixed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he gives up the 3 home runs on Friday night, and on Saturday I asked Gabe Kapler, I said, look, when we were talking about this 7-8 days ago, when you sent him out the first time, Kapler was pretty clear that, while Neris was disappointed, he was certainly resolved to go down to AAA and do the work and figure out what was wrong. Now you bring him back and he has an experience like he had last Friday night, just an atrocious 9th inning. I said, what's his frame of mind now that he's going out this time? And Kapler said, look, I'm hoping it's the same as it was. But, I think, he said that there was a little bit of shell shock involved in what happened Friday night. And that's the risk you take when you take a pitcher like Neris, who you knew needed to be away for a little bit, and you bring him back before he's ready, and then he has a bad experience. You wonder if you've lost him for a little while now. And I think it's going to be really telling how he goes to AAA and how he fares down there and what he's able to sort of figure out and put together, and whether he can come back at some point in the summer or maybe even as late as, September 1st. And can he be a guy who contributes to this bullpen? If he can, I think it's a bonus, but I don't think it's anything that they can necessarily count on as we sit here on almost the 4th of July.
Scott, you've covered baseball for a long time. Your first experience, I guess, getting up close and personal with Gabe Kapler on a daily basis. What's been your thoughts and take on his bullpen approach and how he uses it? Because I know that raised a lot of eyebrows in the beginning of the season. People thought, well, he's going to burn out that whole bullpen before we even get 30 games in. It's been a different sort of approach, that role-less bullpen. Do you like it? And what's your thoughts on how he approaches the bullpen?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I mean, I've looked at it with kind of a critical, or I shouldn't say critical, I should say skeptical eye. I was at that series in Chicago where the Jason Hayward Grand Slam game, where you're sort of thinking, well, what are they doing here? And I was pretty critical of that. And then a week or so later, I sat with him for about 20 minutes, and we talked about it. We talked about his philosophy on bullpen roles or lack thereof, and he sort of gave me he sort of laid it out for me a little bit. I wrote it in the paper a couple of Sundays ago, and I shared some things that I had found out in a conversation I had with Bill James about the Red Sox experience in 2003 without a closer at the beginning, and probably the most high-profile situation where there was not a closer or a closer by committee, and it spectacularly failed. And we had a long conversation about it, and Gabe sort of laid out where he comes from in this. And, I think it's interesting. I love the idea of taking Sir Anthony Dominguez, who's clearly their best reliever, and moving him around the game and saying, well, if the middle of the order is coming up in a 1-run game in the 7th inning, Sir Anthony is my guy. It's kind of what the Cleveland Indians do with Andrew Miller, and what we're seeing the Brewers do with Josh Hader, and what we've seen other teams do in the past. But the difference is that all of those other teams had a closer for the 9th inning who came behind that relief ace. So Cleveland has Cody Allen, and Milwaukee has Corey Knebel, and who do the Phillies have? Right? So it's great if you want to move Dominguez around the game.
Yoxel Rios.
Yeah,
rolls off the tongue.
Well, it's like it's great if you want to move Dominguez around the game, but if he gets 3 big outs in the 7th inning, people have to get 6 more outs in order for that to matter. And that's where I'm skeptical, is I think, Kapler can do a lot of different things that he wants to do, but when you get to that ninth inning, you almost need a designated guy. And that guy has to know the ninth inning is mine. He doesn't necessarily, I don't think, have to be your best reliever, but I do think the ninth inning needs to be assigned. Kapler doesn't believe that right now, and I think it's important to note that I think he's open to being flexible with that if it really doesn't work, but I think he wants to try it this way, and I think he's pretty determined.
Scott Lauber is with us, Philly.com, The Inquirer. Scott, you wrote the other day about, the midway point that this might have been the best win of their season. I mean, Velasquez gets hit in the arm, makes an unbelievable play, has to get replaced in the second inning. They go to the bullpen, basically to fill that whole game. But that kind of game there to win, and all these one-run games that they've been winning, but why did that game 81 stand out to you?
Well, that game stood out to me for about 24 hours because I wonder whether game 82 topped it.
Wow.
You watched yesterday, and, I watched Gabe Kapler down 3 runs in the 5th inning after his bullpen had thrown 14 1/3 combined innings in the previous 2 games. I watched him pull Jake Arrieta in the 5th inning, and it worked. They rallied to tie the game. And then I watched him use 7 relievers in the next 5 innings, and it worked because the game stayed tied. And then I watched him use the starting pitcher in the 13th inning, and faced with having to put his third baseman on the mound in the 14th inning. And 2 outs away from that eventuality, I saw Andrew Knapp hit a walk-off home run, and I thought, wow. Like, if that's not the best win of the year, then how are we going to top this one? So, I think what stood out to me from game 81 was just, the adversity that they overcame in losing their starting pitcher in the second inning, and after getting crushed the night before, having the sort of bounce ability to kind of come back and win that game against a good team. I mean, the Washington Nationals are a good team, or at least they should be, or supposed to be. And then to watch what they did yesterday, I think just sort of added to what I saw in game 81. I think back-to-back, they were 2 of the better wins you'll see all year, and against a team that's your rival in the division, and I really think that it's got the potential to propel you somewhere.
Hey, Scott, we'll leave you with this. The Phillies the last couple of years have it's always been about who's coming up. When are we going to see the young guys? Do they have any young guys that can help?
Yeah, I think so. Well, look, I think they've got pitching depth. So to me, you lose Vinny Velasquez for 10 days or 2 weeks, however long it's going to be, and you've got the potential, if you'd like, to call up an Enyel De Los Santos or a Cole Irvin, who are AAA pitchers who I suppose certainly qualify as prospects who could come and help you now. I think that's really where the strength of the upper minors is for them, is pitching depth. And so they can withstand a little bit of attrition to their bullpen or an injury here or there to their starting staff, where maybe in other years they really couldn't, or other teams you look at out there who are good teams that maybe don't have that sort of depth in AAA. I think when you think more along the lines of the real top prospects, the guys that we're going to be talking about now over the next 3 weeks, because they're going to be players that the Phillies get asked about in trades, Sixto Sanchez, that type of player, they're further away. And so they're not guys that they can plug in and add this year. They're guys that will either be assets down the road or guys you can use in trades that can help you now. So, I think that's really how I look at it. I think the farm system has some depth at the upper levels and some prospects a little lower down.
All right, Scott Lauber, everybody here. The Phillies 6-4 in their matchups with the Nationals and the Yankees, so they get through a very tough stretch, and it really lightens up following that stretch starting tomorrow night with 2 against an awful Baltimore team, Pittsburgh on the road, the awful Mets, Miami, and then the All-Star break. So they have a chance to really start separating. Can you imagine the Phillies separating themselves from the pack? Scott, thanks so much, man. Enjoy the holiday.
Sure, guys. You too.